Great. So let's talk about it. So agile, when you say agile in our industry, really, you're talking, or you could be talking about a large number of things. So it's kind of a blanketing term, and it encompasses a number of, I guess, concepts. But at the end of the day, um, agile is nothing more than a set of values and principles, really, that a team chooses to follow and adhere to. That in order to get a goal accomplished. Right? It could be a software project, could be anything else really. But what we're going to be talking about today in particular is the agile process that sort of has evolved and emerged from those principles. So we're really going to talk about agile as the process. Yeah, it is based on those principles. It's evolved from them, but we're not really going to go into a deep dive about the principles themselves, right? So we'll forget those. We're also not going to be talking about any sort of framework that's evolved, right? There's a lot of frameworks that implement the agile process and that have come about throughout the years. They're basically all following a similar agile process for the most part, at least. They just have different sort of priorities and put a bit more emphasis on different parts of the process and stuff like that. We're not really going to talk about them at all in this one. We're really just going to talk about the underlying process that they all use. So it's going to be common for most of them, at least. Lastly, we're going to talk about the agile process from a high level. So this is going to be a pretty basic talk, right? It's going to be 30,000 feet, view of the agile process. So it's going to be kind of introductory, if you want to look at it that way. So some of you might already know most of this, but either way, it's a good thing to go back to the basics and sort of brush up a bit on them. The last thing, this talk is based, or you could say derived from, the Clean Agile book by Uncle Bob, along with other research, obviously, but he talks about a lot of the pros and cons and ways of doing agile in his book, which is pretty good. So I highly recommend. But yeah, let's get into it. So the first thing we're gonna talk about is really the motivation about why we do agile, and why it's become sort of an industry standard these days, and a lot of companies use agile to get stuff done. But why is that really, and why do people sort of gravitate towards it? And the best way of sort of trying to answer that is by asking another question first, which is, what is the first thing we know about a software project? It could be any other project, obviously. It doesn't have to be software, like I said, but in this context, this is sort of the most relevant. And yeah, that question is, besides the customer that you're going to be dealing with, and I guess how much you're going to get paid or anything else, what's one of the first things you know about the project? Does anyone have any thoughts, ideas?
What are you trying to build?
It's likely to change.
That's very true. Very also true. But even before any of that, you usually know the due date, right? Before you know what even you're going to try and build, the client usually tells you, we need it by July or whenever, right? So usually there's good reasons behind that, obviously, right? There's usually good business reasons. They, sat around the meeting room probably, and they thought, all right, so we're going to have this trade show coming up, and we need something to demonstrate there or to show there. And that obviously has a fixed date, or they ran out of money in June, or their current solution, the support for it, just ends out in June, for example. So there could be a number of different reasons, but the developers tend to sort of hate deadlines, and they think of them as a bit arbitrary at times. But at the end of the day, they are sort of tied to real business requirements and real business dates. So there's real reasons behind them, generally at least. Yeah, so after you know the due date, then you probably start to figure out and sort of get an idea of the requirements for a project, right? So your first initial reaction is usually, oh no, this can't be done, right? Or your gut feelings is saying, there's no way we're going to meet that deadline with all those requirements. Or that might not be the case even, right? But no matter what sort of your gut feeling is, whenever you see the requirements, you know that one way or another, the project needs to be managed somehow, right? Because you don't know for sure, it's just a gut feeling at the end of the day. So, yeah, that's why management really exists at the end of the day. So if that due date wasn't there and you just had these requirements, then you could just fulfill them at any time, I guess, right? But, you know, that's not the world we live in. So the due date, you have to sort of manage the requirements and the timelines. So that's why management is there. And as we'll see, Agile is a way of dealing with this issue, basically, with this due date and these requirements, and trying to get as much information as possible about how you're currently doing in order to get to that due date in the best possible way. And so we know it's all about management, basically. And then, you know, the question is, if you have that information that Agile gives you, that data about the current state of the project, how do you manage, right? Then you can do a number of things. You're probably gonna, project managers in the room probably know more about this than I do, obviously, but you can change a number of different variables that you've got at your disposal, right? You can modify the schedule, for example, see if that due date isn't as fixed as you first thought, for example, or you can throw more people at the problem, because you know you can go twice as fast if you have twice as many people. We all know that, obviously. Or you can see if the scope is flexible, for example. Maybe they don't need everything by that due date. Maybe they just need some of the things. And the last one I've put on here is quality, which isn't really a variable. You can't, I mean, you can, in a sense, tell developers to stop doing code reviews, stop, I don't know, testing, for example, but it's not really something that you want to change at the end of the day, because it's a very surefire way of slowing things down really well. I think we all sort of know by experience that the best way to go fast is to go well when it comes to at least software engineering. So so that's not really a variable that you can modify, but I've put it there anyway. So yeah, if we've got any project managers on the call, I'm not sure if we do, they'll notice, or they'll realize that this looks like something known as the project management triangle. You probably have seen it diagrammed like that, right? And in this case, the quality isn't even a variable. It's sort of diagrammed as something that is affected by the cost and the time and the scope. So it's not something you can change, really. A good thing to point out is this is sort of a very simplistic and simplified view of all the variables in a project. Obviously, it's usually a lot more complicated. You have a lot more things to take into account. But it's sort of a good way of rationalizing and sort of talking about things, right? And yeah, as I mentioned, that's kind of what, in order to figure out which of these variables to change in your project, and which of the how much to change them and by how much, you sort of need information. You can't just act on instinct or impulse or gut feeling. You have to have as much information as possible about the current state of the project, and that's what Agile gives us at the end of the day. It's really just a means for us to get as much information as we can. And we're going to see how it does that for us, right? So now we're going to go through the Agile process really and how to do it. So probably most of you already know most of this. So we know that in Agile, you take the current date, which is today, and the due date, and you sort of plot out the time between today and your deadline, and you split it up into these sort of fixed time boxes. You usually call them sprints in Agile. And you start from sprint 0 to sprint 1, 2, 3. We'll get to sprint 0 in a second. And in each of those sort of, like I said, yeah, each of those sort of blocks is split up into a fixed length. Usually, the standard seems to be 2 weeks. There is no official standard, but a lot of companies certainly seem to go with a 2-week sprint. We certainly do. So, but that's not really fixed. You can do 3 weeks, 2 weeks, one week. It doesn't change the process really. Yeah, so that's one of the mechanisms that we've got in Agile, right? Another thing we've got is we break up our work. So the work that we have to do between now and the due date, we break that up into a number of stories, or Agile calls them stories, really. So in this case, we've got a login feature for whatever application you want. And it's got a number of stories assigned to it. You've got successful login, failed login, remember password, login animations, accessibility, biometrics, all that stuff. So those are all sort of different, I guess you could call them attributes of a particular feature, right? That's split up into those sections, you could say. And that sort of indicates the work that we need to accomplish, or at least some of it, right? Usually have much more than that, obviously. Yeah, and then the last thing is we assign or attribute a weighting to those stories, to that chunk of work. And that weighting is an indication of how much work is required to accomplish that work, right? To implement it. And there's a lot of different ways that you can estimate stuff like that. You can do it, as I've shown here, which is relative. You can do it absolute with hours like we usually do. But that's not really the scope of this talk, really. But yeah, there are a lot of ways you can tackle the estimation of these things. So yeah, we've got those two things. We've got the sprints and we've got stories with estimates on them, right? And so with that, you can sort of start working. And we're going to start it today, bottom left. And like I said, sprint 0 is a bit of a special sprint, right? It's at the beginning of the project. You usually don't really work on features at that point in time. You don't really work on stories. You generally generate the stories. You get requirements from your client, and you're doing estimates, and you're sort of doing typical traditional analysis of those requirements, right? And that's usually what happens in sprint 0. So you usually don't really have much time to do any development at that point in time. But after those 2 weeks, or after that iteration, you end up starting with sprint 1, right? And before a sprint starts, you try to figure out how much work you're going to take on for that iteration, right? You're going to figure out how much work you think you can handle in those 2 weeks. And because it's the first sprint, you don't really have a good idea. It doesn't make much sense to try and figure that out. So you just take a best guess, really, right? So in this case, let's say 6. Doesn't make much of a difference. What is important, though, is that by the halfway point of the sprint, you do a bit of not a retrospective, but you do take into account what you've managed to accomplish in those 2 weeks. And that 1 week, sorry, if you've got 2 weeks, there's the midway point, so it's 1 week. And you say, okay, so you look at the work that you've done, and you realize you're not really going to get 6 points done in that sprint. So you say, all right, well, we'll play it safe and we'll take the 2 points out and we'll only focus on the 4 points, right? Because that's what we think we can realistically accomplish in that first sprint. And you manage to do that, that's fine, and you implement those stories and they go away. So that's great. But now after that sprint that in the last sprint you got 4 points done. So that's your first sort of bit of data that Agile gives you. And and then you sort of sit down, you've got a sprint planning meeting again, and you're going to plan out what you're going to try and tackle for sprint 2. And how much do you plan in? It's not going to be 6 because you didn't get 6 last time. So you plan in 4, right? Just makes sense because that's what you did last sprint. So that's what you're probably going to do this sprint. And you get to the midway point of the sprint and you realize, oh, we're almost done with our 4 points. It tends to happen that sort of the velocity usually doesn't fluctuate, but during the first couple of sprints, it'll start going up because your collaboration is a bit better. You sort of figure out the requirements a bit better as well. You're a bit more comfortable with the code, the architecture, and working with each other, really. So that's sort of normal that your velocity goes up. And at this point, if you're realizing, oh, we're almost done with those 4 points, we're going to have the next week is going to be, without work. So you realize, all right, we'll bring in the 2 points we're going to do, and we'll try and get those done as well. And you manage. So your velocity went up from 4 points in sprint 1 to 6 points in sprint 2. And that's your next set of data, right? You know that you went a little bit faster now on that sprint. And then you basically repeat that process, right? So the next sprint 3, you're going to plan 6 points. I don't have 6 points laid out there, but you usually do. But we're going to do those 5, and those 2 get completed as well. And you keep doing that and repeating that process. So it's really that iterative process of looking at your current velocity, so how much work you've got done the last sprint, and planning for that in the future, right? So that's your main origin of your data. That's where you get your data. And with that, you can plot that out if you want, right? A lot of companies do this. You usually call that your velocity, is how many points you're managing to complete per sprint, right? So sprint 1, yeah, we did 4, sprint 2, we did 6, sprint 3, we did 5, and then sprint 4, for some reason, went up to 7. So that velocity there tells you how much effort you're more or less going to be able to carry out the next sprint, right? That gives you a lot of power to say, okay, so this team is on average getting about, 6 points done every 2 weeks, right? And with that, you can look at your remaining work, which already has points on it, right? And if you've got 50, say, and you've got six points a sprint, then you know that those 50 points that you've got outstanding are probably going to be done in about 7 sprints or so, right? And that's really the power of it, right? That's the burn down chart. That's plotting and sort of projecting for the future based on your current velocity, how many points of work you're going to be able to finish, and by when they're going to be finished, more importantly, right? So in 7 sprints time, it might not be a very good number, might not be a very good date that you're going to hit, but at least you know now, right? So that's where the management comes in. That's where okay, we've got 7 sprints. That's either like 1 week past the deadline, or 1 month past the deadline, or 1 week before the deadline even, right? So that's when a project manager generally would know that you either need to add more people, or you need more time, you need to decrease the scope, or anything else, right? So that's essentially the power of Agile, the the whole focus of it is to get as much data as possible about your current state of the project, and more importantly, what your current team is capable of achieving by and by when, right? And yeah, that's really signified by these two charts. So the whole point of Agile, you could say, is to get these two charts on the wall, right? And then everyone can see them. You can put them in wherever. You can usually automate them, obviously. If you've got a good enough tool, you can, this can be done automatically after you give it estimates, and it does its thing, essentially. So you're always getting that feedback. And yeah, this gives you a scenario where a project manager, for example, never has to ask anyone, oh, how is anything going in the project? And your first reaction is, oh, it's going great, right? Or it's going pretty well, because you're doing all you can. Obviously, everyone in the team is working, and of course it's gonna go well, right? But that's what it's trying to eliminate, really, is that gut feeling. You shouldn't really have to base that anything or any decision on that gut feeling, and this sort of quantifies it. Yeah, so that's really the Agile process, and it's kind of that simple. It's that iterative approach of producing data. So that is mostly it. Like I said, this was a very sort of brief overview of everything. It's based on that book by Uncle Bob, based on this talk as well, which is pretty good. I'll link it after the talk, and I recommend that talk quite a bit. It's pretty good. But yeah, that's Agile in a nutshell.